My name is Karen Tkach Tuzman. I'm the political director of the Peninsula Young Democrats. And the goal of the panel today is to fill some gaps that I know I have in my knowledge, and I think many of us do, about how we can actually advocate for different levels of government budgets to reflect our local, our community's values. We've been seeing a lot of discussion lately about the idea that budgets are a reflection of values, a reflection of priorities. And we've seen a surge of interest in people getting involved with shaping those budgets. And with some budget votes that got cast recently, I think some people were surprised that, weren't sure how much input they would be able to have in the process at the time of that vote versus, when does the agenda for the budget actually get set? And so these are the kinds of questions we're hoping to answer today. So I'm going to turn it over to each of our panelists to introduce themselves, how the types of budgets they're working with at this point in their lives or have worked with, and then we can go from there. So maybe I'll start us off with Supervisor Pine.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Great to have a chance to join you and talk a little bit about budgets. So I've been an elected official for quite some time now, first serving on school boards and then joining the Board of Supervisors in 2011. So we have a very substantial budget. The county government is often referred to as somewhat of an invisible layer of government, in that you ask people on the street what their city council does or what their school board does. They kind of have a general sense for that. You ask people what their county does and they really don't know. But we do manage to spend, have a budget of upwards of $3.2 billion to allocate to a whole host of very critical services, particularly safety net services. So I look forward to telling you a little bit about the budget and about how the public can become involved in the budget deliberations.
Thanks. Kalimah, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Kalimah Salahuddin, and I'm the president of the Jefferson Union High School District Board. We do not have a substantial budget. We're education, so we're usually struggling. I am also serve on the board of the San Mateo Housing Labor Council, and I recently joined the COVID Recovery Council and the San Mateo County Equity Advisory Board. So that's what I do in my spare time. One of my heroines, Delaney Easton, has said that budget is a statement of values. And that's how I go about my budget process. And we always try to represent who we are as a board by how we spend our money.
Zach, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm Zachery Ross. I am Assemblymember Berman's district director. The state budget is a huge process. I have only in the last sort of 48 hours become a true expert on it. So you can ask me anything. I have it memorized. But we at the state, obviously the state has a very large budget, smaller this year than sort of anticipated, obviously. But there's hundreds of people involved. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to get involved in the process. And yeah, look forward to sharing more and answering any questions folks have.
And finally, Bob, would you close out the introductions?
Hi, my name's Bob Brownstein, and I'm currently strategic advisor at Working Partnerships USA, which is a nonprofit think tank in San Jose where I've been for 20 years. And one of my jobs there is to advise people on immediate local government budgets in the immediate area. And I often get parachuted into other places to help community groups and unions to understand budgets, usually either in big cities or urban counties. And the reason people want me to do that is because before I worked at Working Partnerships for 20 years, I worked in local government, 8 years as the public policy and budget director for the late Mayor Susan Hammer of San Jose, and for 12 years as the chief of staff for a county supervisor in Santa Clara County, Susie Wilson, and worked on the county budget there. So I've seen a lot of budgets, and no two are the same.
Great. So the goal of the panel here is to kind of represent 4 different layers of government that interact a lot with our local communities. So we have Zach representing the state, Supervisor Pine representing the county, Kalimah representing the school district, and Bob representing the city. So, but of course, you know, you have experiences that touch on different aspects of this, so feel free to weigh in, you know, speaking from your past life as well. But given the level you're of government you're representing today, I was wondering if each of you could walk us through what your fiscal year looks like and the types of things that you have to allocate money for in a budget, the categories of things you're set to work with, and at least at a high level, and how that process actually gets made. You know, is there a professional staff? Is it all up to the electeds? You know, do you do it out for 5 years? Do you do it 1 year? Things like that. So maybe Zach, since you're an expert on all things state budget, now we can start with you. And just for everyone to know, hopefully we have a link in the chat or you were able to see this elsewhere, but we do have some visual aids that give some basic information about each level of government to share. But Zach, I'll let you take it away.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so I submitted a visual aid that I would love to take credit for. It's extremely helpful, I would say, but I did not make it. But it really lays out everything throughout the year, and it sort of lays out when is the best time for folks to get involved or more involved in the process. So to sort of start, I would say that right now, so our fiscal year, the state's fiscal year starts July 1. So everything that sort of happens up until then culminates in a budget that begins on July 1st. And then moving forward, basically from July 1st, the best thing about this is so nerdy now, but I feel like if you're here spending your time this evening that you sort of want that, so that's fine. So basically over the next 6 months, all of the different state agencies come together with their sort of budget proposals. And they each, so that's everyone that's like CDCR, that's a lot of different state organizations bring forward their budget proposals, and they bring them to the Department of Finance, and that's a branch under the government, that's a body under the executive branch, working for the government. So they take all of those budget sort of requests, I guess you could say, starting with the baseline budget, and then usually they have a bunch of additional requests built in. The Department of Finance then says no to most of those requests, which is why they're referred to as the Department of No. And so then, but they do bring together all that information, and they sort of they present it, they give it to the governor, and the governor produces his first budget on January 10th. And January 10th is when the legislature starts to get involved. The original budget is based off of sort of hypothesis guesses of what the income is going to be. So for context, our income was projected to be, I have these numbers somewhere, about $60 billion more than what it ended up being. And so we take that information, we break it out into a bunch of specific categories, and then the governor presents that to the legislature. The legislature, which is obviously sort of our field of expertise, which is my field of expertise, takes that, and then they distribute it between the 6 different, they take it all to the budget committee. So there's one big budget committee in the assembly. Assemblymember Berman is not on the budget committee, but Assemblymember Mullen is on the budget committee. And so he and his staff are involved a little bit more sort of throughout the process. And then there's a big budget hearing, and involved in that, the Department of Finance is very involved. And then there's something called the LAO, which is the Legislative Analyst's Office. This is like a nonpartisan body that technically, I believe, works, I think they're funded through the legislature. I should know this because I just read the budget, but I don't. And then so with the Department of Finance, the LAO works with also the budget has its own staff. So those are a lot of the folks who are at the assembly level are really doing sort of the nuts and bolts work of the staff, is the staff of the budget. And then the budget, there are 6 subcommittees within the budget. And so the state breaks down everything and they assign it to those 6 budget subcommittees. And those are Health and Human Services, Education, Finance, Resources and Transportation, State Administration, Public Safety, which perhaps is a theme of tonight, which is Budget Subcommittee 5, and then Budget Process, Oversight, and Program Evaluation. And so they will have hearings all open to the public, basically starting around February, and going through to early May, early May, late April, and they'll discuss all of the different sort of budget allocations that are in the original budget. And then the governor will take a lot of that information, and then on May 14th, I guess of this year, I think it might change a little bit, but very little. In early-ish May, the governor releases what's called the May Revise, and so this accounts for a lot of the changes in revenue expectations, a lot of the changes that the legislature has asked for, and produces a new budget. So that's sort of his final, quote unquote, final draft, I would say. And then after that point, the leadership of the Assembly and the Senate get together and they produce a joint budget for the state legislature. And then they'll bring that to the governor. They have a deadline to finalize the budget by June 15th. It's a constitutional rule. They don't get paid if they don't finalize the budget by June 15th. And remarkably, they have never failed to reach that deadline once that rule was put in place. So June 15th, and then usually by then that's a finalized budget in partnership with the governor. This year was a weird year because we had a lot of sort of unexpected work stoppages, for lack of a better term. So we passed our final budget, and then they still had to hammer out the final details with the governor. And then that is then voted on. That's the state budget, and then it goes into effect on July 1st. So that's sort of our year of budget.
Thank you for walking us through all of those details. And so it sounds like we're at the New Year's, in a way, of the budget right now. So it's good context. Supervisor Pine, would you like to give us a rundown of how sort of the budget calendar year for the county and the kinds of things that you have to consider and allocate money for?
Sure. So let's just kind of start with the process to begin with. So right now the county has a 2-year adopts budgets for a 2-year cycle, and we're coming to the end of our second year. Our second year of our current cycle is the fiscal year 2021. So the year concluding on June 30, 2021. And typically, when we look at the second year of a 2-year budget, we don't do a lot of adjustments. But this year is unique because, of course, we are facing the economic consequences of the pandemic. So at a recent meeting, we kind of adopted just a temporary budget for the 2021 year, knowing that we have to do a lot more work on it between now and September when we intend to finalize it. So this will be an interesting exercise for this Board of Supervisors because we've enjoyed this incredible period of prosperity. When I joined the board in 2011, we were still at the end of the recession. But by 2012, 2013, everything was up and to the right from that point forward. So we've really enjoyed an incredible period of prosperity. And the county benefits tremendously from growth in property values, from growth in sales tax, A lot of our funding comes from the state, so a healthy state budget is beneficial. So this is the first time in a very long time that the making reductions. So in the very near term, between now and the end of end of September, the board will be meeting frequently to make adjustments in this fiscal year that ends in June of 2021. So, you know, we recently, again, passed this placeholder budget, but it was simply to give us some more time to understand what our revenues are going to really look like and how the economic picture is going to unfold. So there will be a lot of opportunities for the public here in these next couple of months to influence this budget in the short term. And, you know, we're expecting to see upwards of $100 million in revenue loss from, you know, sales tax alone. So we anticipate some fairly substantial reductions. Now, when we finish this fiscal year, the current year we're in, then we start another 2-year budget cycle. So to cover fiscal year 21-22 and 22-23. And that budget will be worked on in earnest, you know, beginning in January of next year. And one observation I have over the years is our budget is really big, it's really complex, and it's to be honest, it's heavily staff driven. So the county manager will start meeting with department heads at the end of this year and start sketching out, you know, what a budget should look like for the following 2 years. So there's a lot of work that gets done outside of the public eye, which we can talk more about, because, you know, eventually a proposed budget will be published, you know, probably in May or June of next year, again for the subsequent 2 years. You know, it'll be a 1,000-page document representing, you know, thousands and thousands of hours of work. And then there'll be public hearings on this budget. But historically, you know, 98% of it is already kind of done at that point. Now, that's not to say that a board of supervisors couldn't make some radical changes in that final month or two prior to the adoption. But that has not been my experience on this board. Instead, you know, where the changes happen are more, again, in this non-public period where, you know, supervisors have a particular issue of interest, or, you know, have discussions with the county manager or with department heads, or a lot of this is kind of relatively informal. So maybe I'll stop with that for now, just to say that at least at the county level, at least in San Mateo County, when that big fat budget book gets published, it doesn't change that much after that, which has always been something I've really wrestled with. Because there does seem to be a little bit of a disconnect in that. By the time the public sees it, an awful lot of decisions have been made. That's just a reality of dealing with a $3 billion budget. So just to speak very briefly about our budget, and I included some slides if people would like to learn more, just to give just a kind of a top level, very top level sense for, you know, county revenues and expenditures. So you'll often hear us say we have a $3.2 billion budget. It's a big number. But, you know, within that is upwards of $900 million of reserves and of money that had been appropriated in prior years and not spent. In other words, the money is allocated and will be spent, but it just wasn't spent in the designated time frame. So that brings your total budget down to about 2.4 in reality. And then when you look at how that comes together, there's two types of funding. There's general funds and non-general funds. So of that 2.4, about 8,000 is what we call non-general funds. And those are, the best example is like our medical center. Enormous operation, our hospitals and our clinics. So, we recover lots of payments from the government for the service, from the federal government for the services we render, through, or from the, for example, through like Medi-Cal. So, those are sort of basically fee for services. It's not really discretionary per se. So that, leaves the general fund at about 1.5 million. And where that money comes from, the three big contributors are our taxes. We receive about 25% of every property tax dollar. So you can see why the booming real estate market helps the county. We receive substantial sales taxes, particularly through our Measure K, 1/2 cent sales tax. And there are others, like there's a public safety sales tax, and that's a critical revenue source. And then what we call intergovernmental revenues. The county gets paid to do things, particularly by the state and by the federal government. So that's kind of a snapshot of the high level. And then in terms of where this money goes, if you look at our expenditures, what the county's primary mission is to implement the social safety net, to take care of people, with needs that we have an obligation to meet, whether they're healthcare needs or people involved in criminal justice issues or social service needs. So health services, criminal justice, social services, that's really our bread and butter. And our health operation alone is almost $1 billion enterprise. We treat, like, I believe it's 1 out of 7 county residents utilize the county health system. We have substantial behavioral health and mental health resources. But despite the scope and breadth of these expenditures, again, if you ask people what the county does, they just don't know, because, if you're not a client of the county, you don't really see this directly. But we would be in a very difficult place if there wasn't a county to provide these services. Again, this is, we are the implementer of the social safety net, and that's where we spend the bulk of our money. So health is our biggest expenditure. Now, criminal justice is a big ticket item. That's over $400 million, and take a while to explain all that. And between now and the end of September, I'm going to learn a lot more about that, because that issue is front and center. But we run the jails. We have the sheriffs that patrol in 5 or 6 who provide police services in 5 or 6 of our communities. We provide law enforcement services for our public transit agencies. The district attorney, the private defender. There's a lot of things in that bucket. And then the third one is social services, and those are, providing various food resources and income supplements of various kinds that make up a big part of our budget. So again, I just want to give people kind of a taste for the scope and magnitude of what we do, and where these monies do come from.
Thanks for walking us through that. And I agree. I mean, before I got involved with the Peninsula Young Democrats and started to really learn things, I didn't know about the county level in particular a lot. So I really appreciate you, taking the time to educate us on that. Kalimah, would you like to go next to walk through what it means to take on the budget as a school district president?
Sure. I think just to start off, I'm here representing all school districts, and San Mateo County is really unique in the vast disparity of funding between each school district. So there's a school district in San Mateo County that's funded a little under $10,000 per student, and then there's another one in San Mateo County that's funded close to $25,000 per student. So there's vast inequities in funding. per pupil funding in San Mateo County. So this is a general overview, but some districts are so low funded that their spending levels and their flexibility around their budgets are non-existent, because everything that's not going to staffing is going to just keeping the lights on and essential services. But just like everyone else, our fiscal year starts in January when they approve. Hopefully, normally they approve, the state approves its budget, and our CBO can kind of get her teeth into it and break it down and start breaking it down to what it means for us as a local entity. So that's the start of the fiscal. In terms of community input, that process usually starts for most school districts, in particular ours, in the fall. So all California schools use the LCAP process, the local control accountability formula, and the local control accountability plan. We love acronyms in education. We use tons of them. And so for the LCAP, you are required by the state to get feedback on the budget. And for my district, we take that very seriously. So in the fall, we start holding LCAP meetings to talk about our goals from the previous year, how we spent the money, and educating parents, community members, and stakeholders on that. And then walking them through the goals for the upcoming year, and starting to get the feedback on how we should be spending the money for the next school year. And then the budget comes around in January. We usually get an update, but nothing is really finalized until May, when the governor does the May revise, and that's really like the real budget dollars for us. And so that is when we'll have our work study. So the budget work study is the board meeting where the board and the executive cabinet with the superintendent really do a deep dive into the budget and make a lot of the final decisions that are going to happen. So we take into consideration all the feedback that we've gotten from the LCAP. Any community members, that is the time, that is usually the last time that you will have input and really give us your opinions on how and what we should be spending the money on. So we'll make a lot of adjustments and give feedback on the recommendations given to the district to us at that May meeting. We're a high school district, so we can have a lot of engagement and input from our students. So we have a student advisory council. We also have student trustees from all 5 of our schools that sit with us on the board. So the student advisory council also, during the same time, they do research on different areas that they would like to see us make changes, but any changes usually require funding. So they're really telling us how they would like us to spend money. So they research usually 3 or 4 different things that they would like us to give input on, and they make that presentation usually right before we have the May revise meeting, the budget meeting. So we have input from our students too, and that is a full fall process as well. They work it out, the presentation, the recommendations, they go to each of the schools to get feedback from the students, and then they come to us and present. So we have the community engagement meetings that can include includes mostly adults, teachers, and parents, and any other person in the community. And then we have a student pathway that's student driven and is really just their voice. And so we take all those things in consideration and create the new budget for the next year. For most districts, including ours, 65 to 70% of our budget is staff. So salary and healthcare expenses, retirement, things like that. So it's really, we're figuring out what to do with the other allocation, money that's not allocated, and that is not specifically tied to certain things. Like, so there's money that we have to spend on special education, there's money that we have to spend on English language learners, there's money that's tied to other underrepresented groups like low income, foster care, etc. So, and again, that's why I'm dependent on the district. There may not be a lot of wiggle room for how or what we spend money on. We have a public hearing in June. That's just the last final approval and feedback for the budget, and then we approve it later in June. And it goes to that LCAP, which is the budget, but it's also our goals in just one document, goes to the County Office of Education for review. And they make sure that we are adhering to all the California guidelines that say we have to spend certain amounts of money on those underrepresented groups, and make sure they're actually spending in a way that actually benefits those student populations. And they give us a report back, and then we start the process again.
Thanks for walking us through that. And I really appreciate, in particular, hearing about the student opportunities for engagement and input. And so, Bob, I was wondering if you could talk to us about how cities set budgets. And one thing that I've heard is that different types of cities have maybe different processes based on if they're, some cities are their own counties, some cities are, chartered in a certain way. So if there are sort of nuances that change dramatically between cities, appreciate that perspective too. But basically how you see cities approach budgets in your current position and in your time in San Jose.
Okay, and I'm going to talk about city budgets from the perspective of somebody out there who wants to do something with the budget, as opposed to what it looks like from the people who are inside. And first point is that this isn't a normal year. So there's an event that isn't in a normal budget cycle that's going to happen, and I call it the waiting for McConnell event, which is people are basically waiting to see what the federal government is going to do in terms of another major stimulus or state and local bailout. And the guy who's going to decide when that happens and how big it is Mitch McConnell, unfortunately. So we're waiting for McConnell. And there's that event, and it will have significant impacts on city budgets. And there will be some kind of process to figure out what to do with the consequences of McConnell's decision. And there will be room for public input when that happens. So that's the abnormal event. Now, to get back to the normal timeline, the first thing that would happen after the budget's already been adopted, it was adopted at the end of June. First thing that happens is a government is going to have its audited financials that are going to come forward in fall. It's a document called the Annual Financial Report, Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, or CAFR. And what's important about that document is the numbers in it are accurate, as opposed to the numbers in a budget, which are all inaccurate. Budgets are projections. Nobody's got a crystal ball. But the CAFR data is accurate. It shows you exactly what was going on the last day of the previous fiscal year. So if you want to know whether there's any money lying around someplace, which is what you really want to find to make something happen in a budget, the CAFR is a good place to look. The second time would be a mid-year budget review. So most jurisdictions will say, all right, mid-year, we made some projections. Were we right? Were we wrong? Let's see what's going on. And if by some chance the mid-year shows there's extra money lying around, then there's an opportunity for sort of reopening the budget process and making some appropriations. And if there's something that you really care about, you can do that. Then you start the formal process for the next fiscal year. Usually in the city, there's some formal opening for the public to give advice about priorities for the proposed budget. In some cities, it may be informal, like apparently is the case in San Mateo, but usually in cities, there's some formal process. So you could get up there and say, we should spend more money on affordable housing or whatever it is you like. And there will be some way that the city council can give guidance to the people who are putting the budget together, which is staff, to say these should be priorities or these things should be lesser priorities. Then the proposed budget comes out. And as was pointed out in San Mateo, once the proposed budget gets out, it's very hard to change. And there's a reason for that. The proposed budget is balanced. Every dollar is going someplace. So as opposed to prior to that point, we simply say, I'd like to see something in the budget. After it's come out, you got to say, I want to take money away from A and put it in B. And A is never going to go gently into that good night, which means you're going to have challenges in terms of making that happen. Usually after the proposed budget comes out, there's some kind of process in which the legislative body, the city council, reviews it, and there may be public hearings, there may be committee hearings, And then it finally goes to the legislative body for adoption. There's usually one last hearing, and then it's put to bed. General rule in terms of trying to make something happen in this budget, the bigger the thing you want, the earlier you have to start. You know, can you show up at the last minute in a city like San Jose in June and try and get $15,000 out of the budget? Maybe. But if you want 10 million, forget it. You can't show up at the last minute in June. You have to be working on that way, way, way earlier. In terms of the relationship between staff and elected officials, it's going to vary by the kind of city that there is. If it's a small city, part-time city council, long-time city manager, staff are going to drive practically everything. If it's a big city with a strong mayor form of government, the mayor is essentially the chief executive of the city, then it's a whole other story, and there's going to be much more opportunity for public input in terms of the budget process. In general, you can say what staff does is they make the projections and they do cost analysis. And what the legislative body does is it makes priorities and it adopts the budget. Staff can't adopt the budget. You need a legislative body to do that. For cities, most of the revenue that cities get comes from local taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, utility taxes, business taxes, transiency occupancy taxes, construction taxes, et cetera. And most of the money is spent on salaries and benefits, and the two largest departments are almost always police and fire. If you're sitting outside and you want to move money around, one of the important questions you have to ask is, of the revenue that a jurisdiction gets, how much is discretionary? And when you want to find out whether money is discretionary, you need to look at the source of the funds, not necessarily where it's being spent. So money could be spent in a department, and some of that money is discretionary, some isn't discretionary, it's tied, and you find out by looking to see where the money came from. So that's sort of a quick overview, and we can get into more details if people are interested.
Thanks, Bob. So one thing I wanted to put out as a question to the whole group, and I do want to leave time for some audience questions in the last 10 minutes or so. But the concept, and you alluded to this, Bob, of staff and the interplay between how much do the electeds do, and how much do the staff do, and who does it when. So basically, if you're a member of the public, you want to get involved early for the next budget cycle. Who do you start with? Do you start with your elected? Do you start with staff? Can you contact staff directly? If someone really wanted to roll up their sleeves and get into it, what would be the appropriate points of contact?
Well, at the city level, I mean, you could. There's nothing illegal about contacting staff, except they probably aren't going to pay a whole lot of attention to your issue. You need somebody who represents you to do that. So your best bet is to contact an elected official, and the best bet is to not do that alone. You want to basically have a coalition. Ideally, some of those members of the coalition are people the elected official knows. The best strategy in working in cities is what's known as an inside-outside strategy. You got somebody, elected official, who's championing what you want, and you're outside providing additional political support, and you try and, with that framework, try and get staff to be responsive in terms of doing analytical work that the elected official doesn't have adequate staff to do, and which you, as even if you're very active citizens, may not have enough information to work on.
Thanks. Supervisor Penn, I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a bit more about this issue of, you said you struggle with the notion that sometimes the budget, by the time the public input process can happen, it's a little sort of baked already. So what are perhaps some not commonly exploited ways for the public to get more involved earlier on?
Is exactly right. The earlier the involvement, the better. And you need to go to your elected officials and hopefully form a partnership with him or her to, think about, how you want to try to move the needle in a more substantial way. Yeah, the idea of influencing it in those very last month or two is again. So, I'm thinking a little bit about the current situation now with all the interest in looking at how we do law enforcement and how much should we appropriate to law enforcement. So for citizens to influence that, they would want to start talking to boards of supervisors now, thinking towards the 2-year budget that we're going to adopt in June of 2021. Because again, the type of change that many people would like to see in law enforcement, is significant, and can't be accomplished in the final inning of a budget process. In San Mateo County, supervisors, well, I think all elected officials, but certainly boards of supervisors, really do take coalitions of people very seriously. Well, I just give you an example I'm working on currently. So the child care community has all come together because they're very worried about the state of child care in the county with the COVID pandemic and so many of the home-based care being shut, or we might lose these providers. And there's certain monies we've received from the federal government, these CARES money. And so a large coalition, approached us, and myself and my colleague Supervisor Groom are very engaged with this coalition now to think about what can we do with this CARES money to try to support childcare. So I think that is a strategy that can really pay dividends.
Thank you.
And it can't be early enough. It just can't. That is such an important point.
Loud and clear. Kalimah, I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned from the education standpoint, scarcity is often, unfortunately, the name of the game. And particularly in specific districts, specific schools. A lot of what we're hearing now is, as Supervisor Pine mentioned, there's scrutiny around the money going to law enforcement. And one of the places that people often say, shouldn't it go to instead, is schools. And so, for people who would want to advocate for more funding for schools, as parents, as students, and just community members, what are the most effective ways they can advocate to make schools better funded? And and where would that come from?
Okay, so for all districts, it's the state. So we have the Schools and Community First measure that's on the ballot this November. Hopefully there'll be future ballot measures that will come on that will look at increasing overall funding in the state of California. Because just to clarify, the national average of funding for the state of California is around $12,000 per student. In Alaska, they spend $18,000 per student in Alaska. In New York, they're spending $25,000 per student, and also in Massachusetts. So who do our students compete with for jobs, especially in this area? It's the counterparts that are coming from New York and Massachusetts who've got a much higher resource level of education than folks here in California. So the only way to raise funding is to raise taxes somewhere in the state of California. So however comfortable, the Schools and Community First is looking at one of my favorite places in the world, that uses an example, is Disneyland, but they do not pay their fair share of property taxes right now. They've been funded, they're paying property taxes from when they were built and not paying their current fair share. So looking at those type of businesses that are not paying their fair share of taxes and bringing them to today. And then I know that there was look at wealth taxes, other things like that to bring our per pupil spending up to our partners. You know, we should be a New York, we should be a Massachusetts. I would settle with being in Alaska, you know, if we could get close to that right now. But the cost of living and the cost of doing business, and we're not even funded at the national average. California falls below the national average of per pupil funding. So that's the first way. The second way is local parcel taxes. So a lot of school districts have done that. And, you know, the hard part about a parcel tax is that you need to have 2/3 of people agreeing with you for it to pass. And, you know, you can't get 2/3 of people to agree on what kind of cookie to eat sometimes. Like, it's really hard. So to get 2/3 of your community to say, yes, I want to pay more in revenue in the property taxes, that could be a challenge. So those campaigns are always grassroots campaign with a bunch of really dedicated teachers and parents and students. So they could always use more volunteers. So, you know, sometimes I try to help parcel taxes outside of my district because I know how hard that is. So anytime you hear a local school district is running a parcel tax, if you have the time, help them. Because I don't know any district that doesn't need the revenue. No school district in San Mateo County pays their teachers enough to live here, even the highest funded ones. So everyone could use a little extra money. And those are the way. And then for facilities, it's bonds. So passing bonds. I know some districts have education funds and other ways that they raise money, but the reason why I prefer the state is because every district doing different levels and being successful or not successful, depending on a variety of different reasons, increases inequity. And so some districts are very successful with passing parcel taxes, and other districts try, and they just are not able to do it. So that should not be the determining factor of whether a student receives a high quality resourced education. So that's why I look more to the state to raise us all up. Oh, and quickly, on SROs, I know there's been a lot of thing about funding SROs, and our district does not fund an SRO, but to me that while I agree that budget, you know, our money is scarce and we probably should not be funding SROs, just because you don't fund an SRO does not mean that police are going to be removed from campus. So I would say if your goal is to not have police on campus, it would be better to focus your energy at school policy and the policy around when police are called and how often they're able, you know, when they're able to be on campus. And another thing is there's a California law that allows police officers to question students without a parent and without even calling the parent. So they can hold a student in a school for hours and question, and a school district is not allowed to inform the parents that this is happening. A principal, so right now principals or counselors try to stay with that parent, but that's dependent on school policy. Police officers are not allowed to do that on their own property. They're only allowed to do that in a school district. So that to me is where the energy should be focused, because that is a direct school to prison pipeline. They can lie to students, they can say whatever they want, and they can hold them for a long period of time, and that student cannot call their parent. So a lot of parents find out after all this has happened, and their student has probably confessed to something. Maybe they did it, maybe they did, but it's way too late. So that is where I would focus energy.
Thank you. And Zach, before we turn it over to some audience questions, Kalimah set you up to answer for some state level policies. So really my question to you is you know, given that the state does set so much in terms of budgets that trickle elsewhere, what is the best way for someone in any district to advocate for changes in budget at the state level? Would they start with just their local district office, calling in and giving comment? Would they request meetings? Should they go to the person who's on the committee? How would someone best go about it?
Yeah, I think I don't think any of those are wrong answers. A lot of it depends on what you're interested in changing in the budget. And I obviously agree with Kalimah, and I know we hear a lot from school board members and teachers and students and everyone, and it's something that it's hard to do massive changes like we had a bill this year, or Mark was, Assemblymember Berman was a co-author of a bill this year that would have increased LCFF grant funding, and it's dead now, obviously. And now, I mean, now we're moving backwards, and who knows when, I mean, optimistically, hopefully soon in the next like 3 or 4 years, we get back to where we were last year. So those sorts of like real substantive changes, and it's hard to raise revenue too. You need 2/3 vote in both houses to raise revenue, to increase taxes or increase, depending on how you word it, increase fees at any level. And it's fine for us, and Assemblymember Berman, Assemblymember Mullen, we live in the districts that everyone here lives in, and so those are safer votes. And some of our sort of counterparts in places like Fresno or in Bakersfield or in Stockton these are all places that are experiencing very different political realities. So I'd say one thing to do is to give support and give cover to those people as part of getting to that 2/3, because without them being in office, without them, SB1 is a great example. We passed SB1 with zero margin, and the next day there was a move to recall one of the state senators, and then he was recalled, and so we lost that seat. And it was a tough vote, and SB1 was an important funding mechanism, and now he's gone. And so then, so there's a lot of complication. I would say also, in terms of sort of more specific advocacy for budget, like I was saying earlier, the budget subcommittees all have particular staffs. And so if you're interested in police reform and public safety reform, Budget Subcommittee 5 has staff members allocated specifically to them. And for the most part, those are staff members that sort of technically work for the chair of that budget subcommittee, but generally speaking, they work for the committee. And those are the folks with a ton of expertise. I know Assemblymember Berman's the chair of Elections Committee. And so we have a person who's been the chief consultant for the Elections Committee for a very long time. And so he has subject matter knowledge that sort of no one else is really going to have. And then staff for specific members, I think what Robert was saying earlier about accountability is very true. I mean, we sort of tangentially through Mark have accountability to people. So we have a much different, so if you come to me or my counterparts in Sacramento, like for us, we have a chief of staff who's uniquely good. I mean, he's been there for 30 years. He knows everything better than anybody else in the building. And so if you come to him, he's going to have the knowledge that a staff member who's been around for a long time will have, have the accountability to the constituents. And so I think that sort of all of those different things are effective ways of advocating for the budget. And I'll just say quickly, and I know sort of timing is an issue, but one of the things that prior to this year, I guess, that was a very effective way of getting something into the budget was through legislation itself. And so you introduce a bill, and as part of that bill, it has to go through a process, and a slightly different process if there's a financial component to it. But that bill, if it passes, will bring with it a budgetary allocation. And so if we passed a bill this year that said that we wanted, I mean, whatever, every student to get a pencil, and then that was funded by the state because it's a state law. And then in next year's budget, there's going to be under the budget ed allocation, there's going to be a little writing that says $3 million that will go to every student getting a pencil. And so that's one way of getting sort of budgetary asks is through legislation itself.
So we've got quite a few questions, and the lights aren't going to go off at 8 o'clock, so we can go a couple minutes over, but I want to be respectful of our panelists' time and everyone's time. So I'm going to see if I can sort of condense some questions that we've been getting. One is around, brought up the COVID-19 crisis and how that's created a crunch on our budget that wasn't there before. So there's going to probably have to be cuts at at various levels. So how are those priorities decided, and who gets to influence the process of what gets cut when something needs to? And
Well, a cut is no different than any other kind of budget decision. That is, the elected officials indicate priorities, and then they won't know exactly how much is going to be saved by removing something or cut by taking something out of a specific department. So they're going to be relying on staff to do the calculations to deal with that. I mean, the big problem at the local level is local governments in California have no authority to raise revenues. All tax increases have to go to the voters, which means, and they can legislatively raise fees, but most of the fees are cost recovery. So, I mean, basically, when there's a shortfall, there aren't many options available to local governments other than cuts. And so the real question is just what gets cut. And there can be a healthy and robust debate about that. But in order to be able to say a better solution is to have more revenue, they either have to put something on the ballot or take their case to Sacramento or Washington.
I would also comment that I think, there's the budget atmosphere is very different between, a time of prosperity and growth and obviously a time of shortfall and cuts. And I think that, the silver lining of a period of shortfall is that it does, force a closer examination of how we spend our money. I mean, in my experience, during good times, you rarely see anybody's budget reduced or any program eliminated. And, in a perfect world, I guess that would happen in the ordinary course, right? You'd evaluate things, you'd decide if what's working, what isn't, and it really wouldn't, and you would do that even if your revenue was growing, because obviously if a program's not effective, you shouldn't fund it. Or if you have an idea for a better program, then the new program should replace the old one. As a practical matter, in my experience, I don't see that happen a lot during times of prosperity. So I think actually this time now, makes it more probable that, allocations can be changed in a more substantive way, or that more creative solutions can be brought forward. Back in the Great Recession, many of our local cities on the peninsula were under extreme financial distress. And a couple of them at that time, San Carlos and Half Moon Bay, decided to contract out their police services to the county. So now the sheriff provides police services in those two communities, which was really a win-win all around, in that the county kind of had the kind of economies of scale to take that on and do it efficiently, while at the same time the cities were saving money. But never in a million years would that happen during a time of prosperity. So even though I think everyone now, in hindsight, after having seen how it's worked out in San Carlos and Half Moon Bay, would say, hey, this is great. Could have done this 20 years ago. It wouldn't have happened. Only because of the budget pressure that people would entertain making that kind of move. So, I do think there's a bit of a silver lining in these periods of shortfall. For example, yeah, I think there's just another way of looking at it.
So we're getting some questions about reading budgets. There are these dense documents, but then also sometimes they can be just a lot more high level than you expect. Like the categories don't necessarily break down to the kinds of, maybe itemized level people were expecting. So what kinds of, I guess the two questions, how can someone who's not looked at these kinds of documents before start to make sense of them? Are there resources or people they could turn to, for example, to help digest that? And And if people look at a published budget and they said, wait, actually I was looking for a lot more granularity, what are the options for actually getting access to that?
I'll just say quickly, for us, it's pretty, I would not try to read the whole budget. I mean, we have a massive, I have it right here. We have like this stack, and this is all just sort of at the very high level detail. So you're not gonna, what I would do is reach out to a staff member. I would reach out to your representative staff, and then say what you're looking for specifically. I wouldn't go trying to take a deep dive into reading the whole thing, because especially at the state of California, I mean, that includes, you can find state legislators' staff's salaries. And I don't know, I mean, you might sort of get a lot more sympathy for us by reading that, but you won't necessarily learn a lot. So figure out what you're actually interested in understanding, then reach out to staff with a straightforward question. And then usually for the most part, staff will be able to help you. And actually, can I quickly say, on the previous question about the cuts, similar to what Supervisor Pine was saying, cuts can be a good thing. I mean, I think that the state of California was in the process of closing prisons, was in the process of like defunding private prisons, has defunded private prisons, but is closing additional prisons, and that's going to be accelerated. And a lot of older folks who are in jail are going to be released earlier, and they're having to relook at sort of the release on good behavior or a bunch of different ways of reevaluating the prison system in California because they need to save money. And so as a result of the need to save money, good things are going to come out of it. So a lot of it's terrible, obviously, when you have a $60 billion shortfall, but there are definitely things that it forces your hand and it forces you to move quicker and then have cover to make decisions like that in difficult times.
And actually, so we've got a couple questions that respond to some of the things that Kalimah shared. So there's interest in learning more about Prop 15, how School and Communities First can help funding for each jurisdiction. And people want to know how to get involved with helping raise revenue for schools. And, you know, also concerned about the other issue you brought up about students being questioned, you know, if they wanted to get more involved in that, how would they do so?
So I encourage everyone to tell your family and friends to vote for School and Community First when it's on the ballot. Spread the word that that's money that's going to go to K-12 and higher education, because they are struggling as well. Especially, I don't know what's going to happen next year with higher ed, and if they have to do distance learning, and a lot of students, including my own daughter, who was going to go on to graduate school, they're deciding not to because you don't want to pay that level of money for online learning. So higher learning budgets are going to get hard due to large drop off of students if they don't have in-person classes. So any way we can help them would be big. How to find out if a local school district is doing a parcel tax. I think if you just check the ballot on the San Mateo County voter website, you can see all the districts that have parcel taxes on the ballot, and then just reach out to that school district or look up their website. Usually everyone has a website and everyone has like a little click here to help volunteer section. And so I love when volunteers come in that I've never met before and aren't parents, and they just say, I just heard that you were running a parcel tax and we wanted to help. Like, that just warms my heart. And then learning about the budget, there was a question about how do you learn more about the budget? We provide an executive summary that we really try to have it in layman's terms so that anyone can understand it, no matter how involved you are in local government or in school districts. And I would encourage you to, you know, if you're at a school board level, to encourage your school board to create documents that parents can easily understand, because parents don't know to vote for increased property taxes and things like that if they don't understand why we need the money. So we need to speak the language of the community. You know, education needs is big in my field, and sometimes we've framed things in ways that folks can't understand. So really making sure that we have documents that are easily palatable for parents. And then ask your school board member. I love when someone asks me to explain the budget. How much do you want to know? So I'm always willing to sit down with somebody and go over our finances so that they can spread that word on too. And my only fee for doing that is to don't hold the knowledge, share it. And then for the laws about police, those are part of Ed Code and state law. So that needs to be changed at the state level. So talking to your state legislator about that. And then talking to your school board about their policies, because it takes a while for state law to go through, and there's been a couple attempts to change this law, but the police union is a powerful lobby, and they have fought that back every single time. So at the local school board level, there needs to be clear policy for principals about when do you call a police officer? When is a police officer allowed to talk to a student? There's clear rules about that, so that shouldn't be only for a current investigation, not just because they wanted to talk to a student. It needs to be a clear link to an ongoing investigation that needs to be clearly defined. Do not allow a police officer to talk to a student without a counselor or principal or some adult in the room with them, and ensure that that student understands that they don't have to answer anything. They do not, so make sure that that student is aware of that. And then just to have a policy that as soon as that questioning is over, that a parent is notified so that a parent can get involved as soon as possible. So really limiting in police interaction with parents students unless absolutely necessary. There's a lot of confusion with principals sometimes if there's not clear guidance. When a police officer comes on campus and says, I need to talk to a student, your natural reaction is to go, okay, just to follow because that's an authority figure. But a lot of principals don't know that's not the case. There should be clear directions in policy that say when, how, and if that happens. That's something you can do now.
So maybe a last question from the audience, and I'll give everyone a crack at it, from where they sit, is given that we are now in the new budget cycle, is there anything we can do to change the current budget, or should we just put our energy towards next year? Be honest. So that's that's the question. Who'd like to go first?
I will just talk really quickly for schools. I would say no right now, and that's because we have no idea how much money we're going to need to spend to have school in person when we need to have school in person. And also we're spending an exorbitant amount of money feeding our students and providing Wi-Fi and providing laptops. So we're spending a whole bunch of money that we had no idea that we're going to have to spend, and we have to prepare for future spending that we have no idea. We have no idea, like, how much hand sanitizer do you need to have on hand to make sure that every student has enough hand sanitizer in a day. I have no idea how much that is, and so we have no idea how much to budget for it. So right now, we're not changing or adjusting spending on anything. We're all kind of in a hold until we see what we need to spend our money on.
And at the local level, it's waiting for McConnell. I mean, the fact is, once that federal bill passes, I think there will be one. Once it passes, to some degree, it's going to be discretionary. It's not going to spell out in detail how every nickel is going to be spent. So once it happens, county budgets, city budgets are going to be reopened, and there's going to be an opportunity to have some kind of impact. Just can't say exactly when and how bad or good the proposal is going to be. But the chance of that window being there is very high.
And back on the county level, as I said earlier, we did sort of pass a placeholder budget a few weeks ago. So there is certainly some opportunity as we adopt the final budget towards the end of September. But the much bigger opportunity is looking at that 2-year budget cycle that really will come to fruition between January and June of next year. Because again, then you're really setting the agenda for 2 years.
Zach, want to close us out?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's there is nothing that's going to change about the fiscal year that started 6 days ago or whatever. But because our budget's annual, because so much happens through legislation during the off season, which is, I guess, who knows when it'll start, who knows what the legislative cycle is going to look like. But we're going to start looking at bill ideas sooner rather than later. And there's going to be a lot of opportunities to shape the budget in a smaller way through there. And so I think, especially if some of these budget ideas, some of these bill ideas actually are cost-saving bill ideas, realignments, prison reform, sentencing reforms. Those are all budget savings. So if those are the sorts of things you're interested in, I would start reaching out as soon as possible, and especially just some of the members on to your own member, of course, and then some of the members in the specific committees. The members in the committees that oversee those bills are going to be the ones most likely to carry those bills, and so working with them, working with your member, and you can do that 24/7, 365. We're here. So.
Well, thank you so much to all our panelists for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. I really think there's a hunger to understand these things, and I really appreciate you coming here and taking the time to do so. I also want to thank our co-sponsors. So this was co-sponsored by the Peninsula Democratic Coalition, our parent club, and by the San Mateo County Democrat Central Committee, or San Mateo County Dems. We also had a great technical assist from the California Democratic Party, who let us use their lovely webinar platform, and we're on hand to answer our questions. And just, shouts out to PYD members who really were involved with this. Aaron Kaiser put in a lot of work. My husband, David Tuzman, is just great in-house production design with flyers and things. And but really, thank you all for coming and spending this hour and change with us. So in the chat, Aaron had put some links about one to a folder that contains a visual aid with some information on each level of government, and some extra information about the county budget as well. She also put in a link. If you are a Democrat under the age of 36 and you think it's kind of neat that we get to hang out with electeds and staff and have these conversations and want to be a part of it, or just want people to text bank to Arizona with, you are welcome. We encourage you to check out the Peninsula Young Democrats, so you can fill out a form to indicate your interest there. And then the last thing is just there was another link for just a casual hangout Zoom just after this, so we can actually see your lovely faces if you want to come. And so just a nice way to break out of the webinar mold and have a little community. But thank you to everyone, and yeah, let's change budgets.
Great, thanks so much.